Welcome to my channel. Subscribe and enjoy daily stories about cheating, revenge, and relationship advice. The town banquet was always a grand affair, an annual event that brought together the town's most influential people, local business owners, and community leaders. The large ballroom of the Hotel Montrose was filled with the hum of voices, the clatter of silverware, and the gentle tinkling of piano music playing softly in the background. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over the sea of people dressed in their finest. I scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces and forced smiles. Laura sat beside me, her hand resting on her champagne flute, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. She wore the dress I had bought for her just last week, black silk, elegant and understated. It hugged her frame perfectly, and as always, she looked beautiful. But tonight, her beauty felt distant. Foreign. It was a beauty meant for someone else. I caught the way she kept glancing toward the other side of the room. Her eyes, quick and careful, flicked toward Michael, her boss, who was laughing a little too loudly at something his wife had said. Laura's gaze lingered on him just a moment too long before she turned her attention back to her drink. I had seen enough. I wasn't stupid. I had been watching for months, piecing together the fragments of her deception, the subtle changes, the late-night excuses, the sudden need for privacy. The missing intimacy, the disconnection. It was all too clear now. Tonight, I would confront the truth in front of everyone who thought they knew us. Taking a deep breath, I stood from my chair and tapped my fork against my wine glass. The gentle chime cut through the noise, bringing the room to a quiet murmur before the voices fell silent altogether. All eyes turned to me, and Laura froze. I could feel the tension radiating from her, though she didn't look up. "Good evening, everyone," I began, forcing a polite smile. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. It's always wonderful to see so many familiar faces gathered in one place, sharing in the success of our town." A few nods and murmurs of agreement came from the tables around me, but the atmosphere felt tense. Something in my tone must have alerted them that this wasn't just an ordinary speech. I glanced down at Laura, her eyes still fixed on the table. She didn't dare meet my gaze. "But tonight," I continued, my voice sharpening slightly, "I have something very personal to share. Something that's been weighing on me for a long time." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face, usually composed, twitched for a brief moment as he sensed something was off. I could see his fingers tightening around his glass, his usual charm fading. Laura finally looked up at me, her face pale. "Robert, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice low and trembling, only loud enough for me to hear. I didn't respond to her. Instead, I pressed on. "There's no easy way to say this, but sometimes, the truth has a way of coming out whether we want it to or not." I pulled out the small remote from my pocket, the one that controlled the screen behind me. "And tonight, the truth will come out." The large projector screen at the front of the ballroom flickered to life, and a familiar image appeared, Laura and Michael, sitting in his office, his hand brushing hers. The video, which I had pieced together over weeks, played out in vivid detail. It wasn't just one clip, it was a montage of stolen moments, an office touch that lingered too long, an embrace in the parking lot, and finally, the hotel room. Their faces were unmistakable, the intimacy undeniable. The room erupted in gasps, shocked whispers filling the space. I could feel the collective weight of the room's judgment settle on Laura and Michael like a lead blanket. Laura shot up from her seat, her hand trembling as she reached out to stop me. "Robert, please, don't do this." Her voice broke, the desperation clear. I turned to her, my expression hard, unyielding. "Don't what, Laura? Don't show them the truth." My words cut through her like ice. "You think you can just carry on like nothing happened? Like I wouldn't find out?" Tears welled in her eyes, her lips trembling as she searched for words. But there was nothing left to say. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. From across the room, Michael stood, his face red, jaw clenched. He glanced around, as though searching for an escape from the situation unraveling before him. "Robert, this is private." "We can," Michael began, but I cut him off sharply. "Private?" I laughed bitterly. "You didn't care about privacy when you were sneaking around with my wife, did you?" "No, Michael, this is exactly where this belongs, out in the open, for everyone to see." Michael's wife, who had been sitting beside him, turned to him with wide eyes, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "Michael, what is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The silence stretched on as the weight of the situation crashed down on everyone. I could feel Laura's eyes on me, but I didn't look at her. I couldn't bear to see the woman I had loved, the woman who had betrayed me so thoroughly. Not tonight. With a deep breath, I took one last glance at the room, at the faces staring back at me, some shocked, some sympathetic, but all of them watching. Waiting. "Our marriage is over," I said quietly, turning to Laura one last time. "Pack your things. You're leaving tonight." I didn't wait for her to respond. I simply walked away, leaving behind the echoes of betrayal, shattered trust, and the life we had once shared. The ride home from the banquet felt endless, though it only took 20 minutes. The streets were deserted, the occasional street lamp casting fleeting shadows across the car's interior. Laura sat beside me in stunned silence, her hands folded in her lap. The echo of the banquet hall's whispers still hung heavy in the air, the weight of the public humiliation pressing down on both of us. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the pressure. The silence between us wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. I had played the video for everyone to see, and in that moment, all the lies and deceit had been laid bare. Now, there was nothing left to say. Nothing that hadn't already been said in that unforgiving footage. As we pulled up to the driveway, I killed the engine and stared straight ahead. The familiar sight of our house felt foreign, like the life we had built inside of it no longer existed. The house was just bricks and mortar now, a shell, like our marriage. Laura broke the silence first, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Robert, please. I didn't want it to be this way." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet car. "Didn't want it to be this way?" I repeated, turning to face her for the first time since we left the banquet. My eyes met hers, red-rimmed from tears she had been trying to hold back. "Laura, you made your choice. This," I gestured to the house in front of us, "this is the result of your decisions." She flinched at the coldness in my voice, her hands tightening around the hem of her dress. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I clenched my teeth, fighting the wave of anger that surged within me. "But you did," I replied, my voice low but sharp. "You hurt me, Laura. You destroyed everything we had. Everything I thought was real." Her tears finally broke free, streaming down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." I looked away, my chest tight with conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, and a sadness so deep it felt like I was drowning in it. I had loved her once, more than anything, but now, all that was left was the jagged shards of a relationship shattered beyond repair. I exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of my breathing. "It's too late for apologies, Laura. You should have thought about that before you went to him." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The house loomed before us, dark and silent. It felt as if the weight of the world had settled between us, an invisible barrier that no amount of apologies or tears could ever dismantle. "I'll pack my things," Laura finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll go tonight." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She knew it was over, just as much as I did. I had already filed the divorce papers that morning, before the banquet. I had made my decision long before the public revelation of her affair. The banquet had only been the final nail in the coffin. Laura stepped out of the car slowly, her movements heavy with defeat. As she opened the door to the house, I could hear the soft hitch of her breath as she tried to keep herself from breaking down completely. I remained in the car for a few more moments, watching as she disappeared into the house. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken words. I entered after her, watching as she moved mechanically through the house, heading straight for the bedroom. She didn't turn on the lights. There was no point. The darkness felt appropriate. I followed her quietly, leaning against the doorframe of the bedroom as she pulled out her suitcase from the closet. The sight of her packing, of this finality settling in, stirred something within me. This was really happening. This was the end of our life together. I never wanted this, Laura said, her back to me as she folded a blouse and placed it gently into the suitcase. Her voice was so soft, I barely heard it. I didn't want to hurt you, Robert. I was lost. I crossed my arms, watching her movements, feeling a hollow ache growing in my chest. You didn't think to talk to me? To tell me you were unhappy, instead of finding comfort in another man? She turned around, her eyes pleading with me, but her words were weak, as if even she knew they couldn't justify what she had done. It wasn't just about Michael. I felt alone. I felt like we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. I shook my head, frustration bubbling up again. So instead of trying to fix it, you threw it all away. You threw us away. Her shoulders slumped as she turned back to her packing. I didn't mean for it to go so far. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. How did you think it would end, Laura? I snapped, unable to hold back the bitterness in my voice. Did you think I would never find out? That we could just keep pretending? She stopped packing, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the suitcase. No. I didn't. But I was scared, Robert. Scared of losing you. Scared that we were already lost. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. You were scared of losing me, so you went behind my back with him. That's the most twisted logic I've ever heard. Her silence was her only response, and in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't just about her affair. It was about the cracks in our marriage that had been there long before Michael. We had been drifting apart, and maybe, in some way, I had seen it too. But I had refused to acknowledge it. I let out a long breath, rubbing my face with my hands. It doesn't matter anymore, Laura. It's over. You made your choice, and now we both have to live with the consequences. The next morning, the news of our public fallout had spread like wildfire. Small towns have a way of magnifying scandals, and this one was no exception. Laura didn't leave the house, and I couldn't blame her. The whispers had already begun. People we had once considered friends turned their backs on her, on us. Her phone rang constantly, calls she didn't answer. No doubt, they were filled with a mix of pity and curiosity. In our town, scandal was entertainment, and Laura and I had given them front row seats. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the divorce papers in front of me. It was all so surreal. A week ago, we were still playing the part of a married couple, however distant we had become. Now, everything was unraveling at an impossible speed. Laura emerged from the bedroom, her suitcase by her side. She stood in the doorway, looking at me as if waiting for me to say something. Anything. I looked at her, but I didn't speak. There was nothing left to be said. Our lives together were over. She opened her mouth, as if to try one last time. But then she closed it, realizing the futility of her words. She nodded slowly, tears pooling in her eyes. Without another word, she picked up her suitcase and walked out the door. I didn't follow her. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. The hotel room was cold, its walls bare except for the generic art meant to add some sense of homeliness to the impersonal space. Laura sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the reflection in the large mirror across from her. The woman staring back looked like a stranger, eyes swollen from crying, lips chapped, and the beginnings of dark circles under her eyes. Her once pristine black silk dress was now crumpled in a heap on the floor, replaced by an old sweatshirt and jeans she had hastily thrown on after packing. It had been 2 days since she left the house. 2 days since Robert had exposed her affair in front of the entire town. 2 days since her life had crumbled into pieces. The whispers followed her everywhere. As she walked through the lobby that morning, the receptionist had given her that look, part pity, part judgment. She could feel it everywhere, the eyes of strangers, the silent accusations, the weight of her guilt. She had ruined everything. And the worst part was, she had no idea how to put any of it back together. Laura stood up, pacing the length of the room, wringing her hands together. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She glanced at it, seeing the familiar name, Michael. Her heart tightened in her chest. She knew he would call. But every time the phone rang, it only made the knot of anxiety tighten further. How had she allowed herself to fall into this mess? She had been so foolish, thinking she could escape the loneliness that had crept into her marriage by finding solace in Michael. But now, as the full weight of her choices settled on her, she realized how hollow it all had been. Michael hadn't filled the void. He had only added to it. The phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. Laura, Michael's voice came through, low and urgent. We need to talk. She pressed her lips together, feeling her throat tighten. I don't know if there's anything left to talk about, she replied, her voice small. You know that's not true, Michael said, his tone hardening. Everything's falling apart. We need to figure out what happens next. Laura closed her eyes, sinking back down onto the bed. What happens next, she repeated, as if the words had lost all meaning. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. What could possibly happen next? Their affair was out in the open, their lives in shambles. The illusion had been shattered, and now they were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. Michael sighed on the other end, his frustration evident. Laura, don't do this. We can fix this. We just need to talk things through. Maybe we can even make it work. Make it work? Laura's voice broke with disbelief. She stood up again, walking to the window and looking out at the small town she had once felt a part of. Now it felt like a prison, a place where her every mistake was under a microscope. Michael, we can't make this work. Look at where we are. Look at what we've done. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Michael, for once, didn't have an immediate response. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost defeated. I didn't mean for it to end up like this. Laura pressed her hand to her forehead, closing her eyes against the sudden wave of emotion that surged through her. Neither did I, she whispered. But it did. And now I don't know who I am anymore. Later that afternoon, Laura sat in a coffee shop near the outskirts of town. It was one of the few places where she didn't think she'd run into anyone she knew. The soft hum of quiet conversations and the smell of roasted coffee provided a temporary distraction from the swirling chaos in her mind. She held her cup tightly, her hands still trembling. She hadn't eaten since the banquet. The weight of guilt and anxiety had settled deep in her stomach, making the thought of food repulsive. But here, in the anonymity of strangers, she could at least try to think clearly. As she stared out the window, she saw a familiar face walk past, a woman from the local PDA, someone she had known for years. The woman paused, catching sight of Laura inside. For a brief second, their eyes met, and then the woman quickly looked away, her steps quickening as if the sight of Laura was contagious. The isolation felt suffocating. Just as Laura was about to retreat further into her thoughts, the bell above the door jingled. A voice from behind startled her. Laura. She turned around to see Sarah, her former colleague and once close friend, standing by her table. Sarah's expression was hard to read, somewhere between compassion and disappointment. Laura hadn't spoken to her since the scandal broke. Sarah, Laura breathed, surprised to see her. "Can I sit?" Sarah asked, motioning to the empty chair across from her. Laura hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sarah sat down, smoothing out her jacket before folding her hands in front of her. The tension between them was palpable. "I heard," Sarah started, her voice cautious. "Everyone's heard, I suppose. I just wanted to check on you." Laura looked down at her cup, feeling a mix of shame and gratitude. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely audible. Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. "Laura, you don't look fine. You look like you haven't slept in days." "Anne. I'm worried." There was a long silence as Laura tried to find the right words. What could she say? That she regretted everything? That she wished she could turn back time and make different choices? That she had lost herself somewhere along the way? "I don't know what to do, Sarah," Laura finally confessed, her voice breaking. "I've ruined everything. Robert, my marriage, my life, it's all gone. I don't even know who I am anymore." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes softening as she listened. "Laura, we all make mistakes. Some bigger than others, but you don't have to let this define you." Laura shook her head, wiping a tear from her cheek. "But it does. I made my bed, and now I have to lie in it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression contemplative. "Maybe. But you don't have to lie in it forever. You can still fix things, maybe not with Robert, but with yourself. It's not too late to figure out who you are, without the lies, without the secrets." Laura's breath hitched in her throat. Sarah's words were kind, but they felt impossible. How could she rebuild when everything had crumbled? The days passed in a blur after that conversation with Sarah. Laura found herself withdrawing further into isolation. She barely left the hotel room, only venturing out when absolutely necessary. The thought of facing the world, of seeing the judgment in people's eyes, was too much to bear. Michael's calls became less frequent, and each time she ignored them, the distance between them grew wider. The affair that had once seemed like an escape now felt like a trap. One evening, after hours of staring blankly at the television, Laura's phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Michael. It was her mother. "Laura, honey." Her mother's voice crackled through the line, thick with concern. "I heard what happened. Why didn't you call me?" Laura closed her eyes, the familiar warmth of her mother's voice bringing a fresh wave of tears. "I didn't want to disappoint you." "Oh, sweetie," her mother sighed. "I'm not here to judge you. I'm your mother. I'm worried about you. What are you doing out there all by yourself?" "I don't know," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." "You need to come home, Laura," her mother said firmly. "You need to get away from that town, from all of it. Come home. We'll figure this out together." Laura clutched the phone, her heart heavy with emotion. She hadn't thought about going home, home felt like another lifetime. But now, as she sat in the cold, sterile hotel room, the idea of returning to her family felt like the only lifeline she had left. "I'll come home," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I need to." And for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope, small, fragile, but there. The journey home felt surreal, as though Laura was drifting through a fog. The long stretch of road, lined with trees slowly turning golden with the approaching autumn, passed by in a blur. Each mile that brought her closer to her childhood home was filled with memories she hadn't revisited in years. It was strange how the idea of home could suddenly shift in meaning. For so long, home had been the house she had shared with Robert. Now, it was the place she had left behind long ago, her mother's modest, old Victorian house on the outskirts of a quiet town she had been eager to leave when she was younger. Laura glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghost of her past self. But the woman staring back was older, worn down by guilt and regret. She looked so different from the bright, hopeful girl who had once left this town with dreams of building a life that was full, whole, and perfect. The sky began to darken as she pulled into the familiar gravel driveway. Her mother's house stood just as it always had, weathered but warm, with ivy creeping up the sides and the same old rocking chair on the porch. Laura's chest tightened at the sight, a mixture of comfort and sadness washing over her. She took a deep breath, stepping out of the car. Her suitcase felt heavy in her hand, not just from the clothes inside but from the weight of everything she had left behind. Before she could even knock, the door opened, and her mother appeared, her face lined with concern but soft with love. "Laura," her mother said gently, stepping forward to embrace her. Laura's throat tightened as she sank into the familiar warmth of her mother's arms. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this, someone to hold her without judgment, without expectation. "Mom," Laura whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Her mother pulled back, looking her in the eye. "There's nothing to be sorry for, sweetie. You're here now, and that's what matters." They stood in the doorway for a moment, the cool evening air swirling around them. Finally, her mother guided her inside, and Laura followed, feeling an odd sense of relief. The house smelled like lavender and cinnamon, just as it always had. It was as though time had stood still here, untouched by the chaos that had torn apart Laura's life. Later that night, after a quiet dinner, Laura sat in her old bedroom, the soft hum of the wind outside her window filling the space. The room looked almost exactly as it had when she left. Her childhood books lined the shelves, the faded posters still hung on the walls, and her old desk sat in the corner, covered in papers and notebooks from her high school days. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror mounted on the wall across from her. This time, though, she didn't look away. She studied the woman she had become, the lines of worry on her face, the sadness in her eyes. It was painful, seeing herself so clearly. But it was also necessary. For the first time in what felt like months, she allowed herself to really think about what had happened. Not just the affair, but everything that had led up to it. The years of quiet distance between her and Robert, the loneliness that had crept into their lives without either of them truly noticing. And the guilt, so much guilt, not just for the affair but for the lies she had told herself to justify it. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. There was no undoing what she had done. No going back to fix the mistakes that had been made. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her mother stepped in, carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you could use something warm," her mother said, offering one of the cups. "Thanks, Mom," Laura murmured, taking the cup and holding it between her hands. The warmth seeped into her skin, grounding her. Her mother sat beside her on the bed, her expression thoughtful. After a moment of quiet, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been carrying a lot, Laura. I can see it in your eyes." Laura let out a long breath, staring down into her tea. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Mom. Everything I thought I had, it's all gone." Her mother was silent for a moment, as though choosing her words carefully. "I won't pretend to know what you're going through, but I do know one thing, you're still my daughter. You're still that same strong, kind-hearted woman I raised. This mistake, this heartbreak, it doesn't define you. It's a part of your story, yes, but it's not the whole story." Laura felt tears prick at her eyes, the weight of her mother's words sinking in. "But I hurt so many people," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Robert, myself. I don't even know if I can forgive myself, let alone ask anyone else to." Her mother reached out, placing a hand on Laura's knee. "Forgiveness is a long road, honey. And it doesn't happen overnight. But you can't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. At some point, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward. What kind of life you want to live." Laura swallowed hard, blinking back her tears. She had spent so much time wallowing in her guilt, in her sense of failure, that she hadn't even considered what came next. All she had seen was the wreckage. But now, sitting here in the quiet of her childhood home, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her that wasn't defined by her mistakes. "I don't know if I'm ready to move forward," Laura admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother gave her a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to be ready right now. But the fact that you're even thinking about it, that's a start." That night, Laura lay awake in her bed, staring up at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the kind of deep, peaceful quiet she hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. Outside, she could hear the faint rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of crickets. As she lay there, her mind drifted back to Robert. She hadn't spoken to him since the night she left. She wondered if he had signed the divorce papers, if he had already started to move on. The thought made her chest ache, but she knew she couldn't hold on to him, not after everything that had happened. He deserved better than the version of her that had betrayed him. And she needed to find out who she was, independent of the mistakes that had brought her here. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, her heart pounding when she saw the name on the screen, Robert. For a long moment, she just stared at the phone, unsure of what to do. Finally, she pressed the answer button, bringing the phone to her ear. "Laura," Robert's voice came through, soft but steady. "Robert," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. There was a long pause on the other end, as though he was searching for the right words. "I didn't know if I should call, but I guess I just needed to hear your voice." Laura swallowed hard, her heart racing. "I didn't think you'd want to talk to me." "I don't know what I want," Robert admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. "But I've been thinking a lot. About us. About everything." She bit her lip, the guilt rising in her throat. "Robert, I'm so sorry. For everything. I know I can't fix what I did, but I just need you to know how sorry I am." "I know," he said quietly. "I know you are. And I'm angry, Laura. I don't know if that will ever go away. But I also don't hate you. I don't know what that means for us, but I needed to say it." Laura felt a tear slip down her cheek. "I don't expect anything from you, Robert. I hope one day you can forgive me. But even if you can't, I want you to know that I'm trying to figure out how to be better." There was another long silence, the kind that was heavy with everything left unsaid. "I hope you do," Robert said softly. "For both our sakes." And with that, the call ended. Laura sat there in the quiet, the phone still in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't expected, a small, fragile sense of peace. Maybe things would never be the same. Maybe she would never fully repair the damage she had caused. But in that moment, she realized something important. She was still here. Still standing. And somehow, despite everything, that felt like a victory.